Hi, welcome. You're listening to People, Planet, Food, conversations about the global food system that I hope are both a cause for optimism and a call to action. I'm Roger Robson-Williams, the Chief Sustainability Officer here at Plant Food Research. I'm interested in how to grow healthy, enjoyable and affordable food in ways that don't harm people or planet. In this podcast series, I'm talking to some of the inspiring people who I've met that are working at this interface and figuring out how we can have healthy people living on a healthy planet and eating healthy food. In this episode of People, Planet, Food, I'm delighted to be talking with Kate Meyer, an expert in using science to inform decision making for environmental sustainability. The work that Kate's leading on planetary accounting has enormous potential benefit for the food system in Aotearoa, New Zealand and globally, and for other sectors of the economy as well. Kate will introduce herself in a moment, but just by way of a general introduction, she is the founder and CEO of the Planetary Accounting Network. This is a not-for-profit that helps people, businesses and governments to operate within global environmental limits using a planetary accounting framework. So I'm very much looking forward to this conversation. Before we get started, I wonder, Kate, if you could just tell listeners a little bit about how you have ended up as CEO of the Planetary Accounting Network.
Yeah, sure. Kia ora. I guess my background is in engineering, which I actually got into because I was really passionate skier and I wanted to design skis. But as I progressed through university, we did this very inspiring course on sustainability, looking at, I guess, the role of engineers in shaping the future. And so as I came out of that degree, instead of going sort of back to skiing, I went forward into sustainable building design and worked in New Zealand and then in Singapore, designing some really incredible and I think globally leading buildings. And I had this one conversation where one of my clients said, Kate, we are going to build the most sustainable building, as he started the meeting. And I sort of reflected on that. And I think this idea that something is more sustainable or most sustainable really doesn't sit nicely with me, because it's this race to be slightly better than everything else that's not good enough yet. And I reflected that I wanted to understand what a truly sustainable building would look like. And at that time I was living in Singapore and I was, popping around Southeast Asia in the weekends as everybody did, flying here and there, and quite aware that probably wasn't the best thing to be doing for the planet. It was quite a long time ago now, so I think flight shaming was much less of a thing, but I was still aware and really wanted to also understand personally what would a good lifestyle look like. And so I started playing around with a spreadsheet and some drawings, trying to work out, what would good look like in an absolute sense. And it felt like a really hard task. And so I sort of parked it for a few years. I moved to Perth and I was leading a sustainable buildings team for Arup in Perth and working with an amazing guy at Curtin University called Peter Newman. He's an IPCC author and perhaps the most positive sort of sustainability specialist I've ever met. And he said, Kate, you should come and do a PhD with me. We want people like you. And I said, oh, don't be silly. I can't think of anything worse than doing that. Until one day it occurred to me that perhaps if I called this idea of absolute sustainability PhD, perhaps somebody would give me a scholarship and I could spend a bit more time and effort on it. And that led to planetary accounting. So planetary accounting is a framework that came out of my postgrad study. I ended up going on an enormous extended community peer review to validate and test it with a lot of different experts around Europe, which sounded really formal in practice. It actually involved packing my 2 preschool kids into a caravan and dragging them around Europe for the best part of a year, and then moved back to New Zealand and set up the Planetary Accounting Network as a basis for people to use this framework.
So it's been kind of literally and metaphorically quite a journey from where you started off thinking about skis.
Absolutely. I think if you had told me this is what I would be doing now 20 years ago, I would be very stunned.
It's really interesting in this space. Maybe it's just the guests that I have interviewed so far in this podcast series, but often people it's been quite emergent, the roles that people have ended up in, not something that's been really kind of planned in the long term. So it's interesting, that's your experience. It feels like we need to have a bit of a conversation about what sustainability means to you before we get on to the interesting topic of the work of the Planetary Accounting Network, because different people have different conceptions of sustainability. So what do you mean by that?
Yeah, it's a really good question and something I think gets debated a lot. If you look up the term in the Oxford Dictionary, sustainability, it means ability to continue in perpetuity. And I think from my perspective, the element that is eroding our ability to continue in perpetuity is environmental sustainability. So while I totally subscribe to needing to address social and economic sustainability as well, I quite often do use the term sustainability when I mean environmental sustainability. But I think it's also worth clarifying. A lot of people these days talk about sustainability versus regenerative sustainability. To me, they're the same, because to be able to continue in perpetuity, we need to regenerate the environment. So I'm a bit lazy in my terminology. I do say sustainability to mean environmentally regenerative activity.
Thanks for that. And I think the kind of linguistic gymnastics that I'm using at the moment are thinking in terms of preserving the possibility that future generations could prosper. And I'm inclined to agree with you that the most pressing issues that might cause that not to be the case are related to environment. Certainly in the advanced economies, which isn't to say there aren't all sorts of problems with kind of modern slavery and so on that we really need to be tackling as well. But anyway, thank you. I think that's really helpful. The other thing it feels like we need to talk about is the planetary boundaries, because my understanding is the work you're doing at the Planetary Accounting Network is very much grounded in solid system science, including this concept of the planetary boundaries. Perhaps you, rather than I, could explain to listeners what the planetary boundaries are and their significance.
Yeah, sure. So the planetary boundaries are a set of 9 global limits that collectively define what is known as the safe operating space for humankind. So I think people talk about planetary limits as a term quite a lot, and it's an interesting concept because actually, even if the planet warms up well over 1.5 degrees, 5 degrees, 10 degrees, I'd be willing to bet quite a lot of money that it will continue to spin on its axis and orbit the sun. It's not the planet that has limits. The limits, when we talk about it, are really acceptable environmental change for humanity. And so that's what the planetary boundaries is. So it's unlike anything that's really been done before, because it looks at how can you define what are the system limits that would allow the Earth system environmental system, the full global environmental system, to stay in a similar state that it has for the last 10,000 years. And that last 10,000 years is really important because it's that time that the Earth has been really unusually stable. It's changed a lot over human history. And then in the last 10,000 years, with this really stable climate, we've seen the development of settled societies, this technological age. So society as we know it today, we only know that it can operate within these stable conditions. And so the planetary boundaries do include climate change and limits for both the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, but also other, they call it radiative forces, but other greenhouse gas emissions, but also the way that we use land and things like that, reflectivity. But it also looks at novel entities, which is anything man-made into the environment. It looks at nitrogen and phosphorus runoff from land into waterways and the effects that can have on marine life. It looks at biodiversity, health, air quality. So it's this very holistic framework. And although it's not every single environmental impact that we could have on the planet, it's all of the ones that could change the state of the planet as a whole.
So would it be fair to say the kind of planetary boundaries define what we need for a livable planet that would support the kind of society that we have at the moment? Absolutely. Right, that's planetary boundaries. What about planetary accounting? What is it and why should I care?
Yes. And it's nothing to do with economic accounting. So many people assume I'm an accountant. It's environmental accounting. But it's a little bit like carbon accounting, where we add up all of the environmental impacts of different activities. But what we do is we put that into context of the planetary boundaries. So the planetary boundaries is really important because it gives us the environmental limits. But it's like a health check for the planet. And so if we translated that into our own health, it would be like taking your blood pressure and your heart rate or your weight. It's really important information, but it actually doesn't tell you what we need to do. Planetary accounting translates those limits into the actions we need to take to return to a healthy planet. And so it would be more like the amount of exercise you need to do or the diet that you need to eat with specific measurable limits so that we can all take ownership of returning the planet to good health.
That kind of hints then, I guess, at the work of the Planetary Accounting Network. But could you tell us what that's about?
Yeah, so our goal at the Planetary Accounting Network is to help people to work out what actions they can take to play their role as guardians towards a healthy planet. So that's from a sort of an individual and community level through to a business level through to a regional level. So as an example, we worked with Dunedin City Council to establish science-aligned targets for the Dunedin region so that they can then look at those and say, well, what are the policies and systems and infrastructure that we need so that Dunedin can operate within a fair share of the planet's limits. We work with businesses to do a similar process, and so we look at all the activities that the business does, and then we look at what are the footprints it has, not just the carbon footprint, but the water footprint, the waste footprint, the biodiversity footprint. And then we put that into context of what would be a reasonable level of impact based on that scientific need that we can derive from the planetary boundaries. And then we do it at a product level where we say, imagine if you had nutritional facts for sustainability, which we call planetary facts.
You mentioned what would be considered a reasonable kind of share of the available space between where we are now and the transgressing as the safe operating space of one or more of the 9 planetary boundaries. Who kind of defines what's reasonable?
There's a lot of value judgment in that. So there are a number of different ways that you could do that, and it becomes quite complex depending on what you're accounting, and what you account in terms of the impacts needs to match how you define the limits. So, for example, if you added up all the activity that happens in New Zealand and then you divided it by the New Zealand population, you would be doing some really strange maths. It would be like saying, I'm going to bake a cake in my house and then I'm going to take it to a party with 40 people, but I'm going to divide the calories in the cake by the number of people who live at my house. So you have to be looking at the same system. So for a city or a region, you might look at the consumption of the people in the city and region, regardless of where the impacts happen. So the impacts of the building materials that are imported, but also you would potentially take away the impacts of anything that is exported. You could divide that number by the number of people to start to get a fair weighting. And you can add temporal elements to say, well, have we benefited from past impacts? There's a way to adjust for equity. Or you could look at things like, how many people does the New Zealand food system feed, and how much does that contribute to global calorific or protein or other nutritional need? And you could use that to divide up a fair share. So there's a lot of different ways to do it. And when you look at reports that do it, there's a lot of misinformation from, I guess, that strange maths of the birthday cake.
Yeah, which is going to be confusing for people who are not necessarily deeply involved in the concept of kind of environmental accounting, or even necessarily, super across some of the existential threats that are posed by the polycrisis of climate change and biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse and so on. But you mentioned a moment ago that one of the pieces of work that the Planetary Accounting Network is doing is trying to kind of help people out in that regard by coming up with labels, for people looking to purchase certain products, so that it begins to, give a sense of what the environmental footprint of that product is. So could you explain a bit more how that works and what it looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. So Planetary Facts are inspired by nutrition facts. And where nutrition facts are really clever is that they give you data in the context of a recommended daily intake. Now, that recommendation would be different for me or for you. I think it's not a personal recommendation on the label, but what it does is it says for an average global citizen, World Health Organization recommends this much intake of this particular calories or protein or fat. And so you can suddenly put data into context. So you might say, oh, well, this product has 8 grams of fat, and that's 12% of a recommended daily limit. It suddenly makes sense. In contrast, at the moment, people are just looking at hanging data. So I went to a kiwi fruit conference recently, and it was a room full of over 100 kiwi fruit scientists. And so I put up the carbon footprint of a kiwi fruit on the screen. It was 125 grams. This kiwi fruit was, I think, getting exported to the UK. And so everyone kind of nodded. And then I said, is that good? Nobody could tell me, because it's just a hanging number. Without context, it's really meaningless. And so what we do with Planetary Facts is we take that idea of the recommended daily intake, but we derive a recommended daily limit from the planetary boundaries. And so we can say, okay, well, that kiwi fruit, I think we looked at 2 kiwi fruit, is less than 5% of a recommended daily carbon budget in 2030. But we don't just need to look at the carbon. We can look at the biodiversity, the nitrogen and phosphorus runoff, the land use, all in that same context. And then we present it visually with a traffic light system so that you can see how much of your daily budget you're using up on any different decision. And while so far we've been focusing on physical products, we're also starting to adapt this to look at services as well. So, what would be the planetary facts of a ride in a jet boat or a luge down from the gondola in Queenstown?
It sounds extremely helpful for conscious consumers that want to better understand the impact of their kind of lifestyle choices. What would it literally look like on a packet of something, or a washing machine, or
yeah? So it's a circle. There's a image of the world in the background with New Zealand nicely aligned, so you can actually see it. Not every world map shows New Zealand up. And then it's broken into wedges of each of the impacts. So carbon, biogenic emissions, nitrogen, phosphorus, biodiversity, air quality. It's hard to rattle off the whole list off the top of my head, but it goes around. But we categorise them in 3 segments of air, land and water, so that for people who aren't really interested in that extra level of detail, they can still really quickly see, well, these are the impacts of air, these are the impacts on water, and these are the impacts on land. So then there's a dotted line to indicate the recommended daily limit, and then each wedge is filled in to show the size of impact. If it's an impact on the planet, but it's less than a daily recommended limit, then it's orange. If it's over a daily recommended limit, it becomes red. That's not to say you can't have something, buy something or consume something that's more than that. It's just a warning, hey, use this with caution. But what we're really stoked about is it can also show positive impact where there's a net benefit to the environment, and that's shown in a green wedge, where the bigger the green, the more positive impact, because we're actually not on a race to zero, we're on a race to that regenerative environmental performance that we need to get to.
I've got a really clear mental picture of that. If any listeners wanted to have a look at a website, have you got a website address you could share?
Yes, it is planetaryaccounting.org. I expect it's /planetary facts, but I'm sure we can give you a link to share with the podcast recording.
Thank you. And are you applying this methodology at the moment in the food system at all?
We are. It's actually the sector that has had the most interest, I think, because we have to eat. And so, there's so much debate about the impacts of food, but this is an area that we really, if we're going to have any environmental budget to spend, this is one of our basic needs. So we have done it on farm across about 15 beef and lamb farms. We've done it for Raglan yogurt. That one's already available out in the ecosystem, so you can see that on our website and on LinkedIn, and I think on Raglan's website as well. We are also working on, food sector adjacent products like in the wool sector space and natural fibres.
So there's the concept here of planetary accounting. You're working hard to translate that into useful information for at different scales. So for, you mentioned Dunedin City Council, and then for individual customers, potentially customers of Raglan yogurt, other yogurts are available. That all sounds really important and useful. What kind of challenges are you facing in trying to kind of scale that?
I think there's a real sense that there needs to be one system that everybody's using. And so I think 2 years ago, when we hadn't had brave brands join us in this journey, and there's a lot of these brands who are really brave, but it takes quite a lot to say, well, we're gonna go first. So brands like Raglan, like Silverfin Farms, like Bremworth Carpets, who are saying we can see the value of this as that single system, have gone through that proof of concept stage. I think now we're moving actually out of some of those key challenges into a bit of a wave of momentum where the industry is starting to say, this is a really neat opportunity to showcase NZ as a whole. There's mixed data, but a lot of data that I've seen suggests that the environmental performance of New Zealand food is really globally leading, particularly when you take that more holistic perspective, not just looking at carbon and greenhouse gases, but looking at that whole perspective, biodiversity, the way that we use land, the amount of fertilizer that we put onto the land and things like that. This is an opportunity to put all of that data into context that's meaningful and show the world that what we're doing is really amazing. And so we're getting this really cascading effect at the moment where we've actually set up a food and fibre sector collaboration, and anyone's welcome. If we haven't reached out to you yet, it's not because we don't want to talk to you, so please feel free to drop us a line. We'd love to speak to you so that we can go and pilot this as a system for the entire system, from on-farm to through production to conversations with retailers to that end consumer label on product.
Really great to hear that you're getting some traction and you feel you might be at that kind of tipping point. Could you say a bit more about some of the wins you've had recently? Because I know you've just come back from quite a significant overseas trip. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I got invited to a conference called Digital with Purpose, which is a big international conference. It was in Lisbon, and so I went over to speak on a panel and was alongside the Director General for the Environment from the European Commission, which leads the Product Environmental Footprint Labelling Scheme in the EU. And they have done a lot of design and testing of that system, and there's some really positive aspects to it. It's based on life cycle assessments, which is the same framework that underpins Planetary Facts assessment, which has got a lot of rigour because it's based on international standards that have been used for quite a long time. But they've had some real challenges, both in the way that it works on farm, because of the specific measures that they use, and because of it having a lack of comparability across products. And so you can compare a yogurt to a yogurt, but you can't compare actually even a dairy yogurt to another type of yogurt, or yogurt to any other product in the supermarket. And so the scores are just based on your own category. That's not data and context. It's are you better or worse than other people doing the same thing as you? Which is actually not what we need to go and be back within the planet's limits. And so what's been really exciting is that the European Commission is very excited to see what Planetary Facts could do to help them advance that PPF labelling system. We've also had a lot of interest from the UNFCCC on the back of that conference to help them to inform what a planetary diet would look like. So there's a lot of, again, interesting use of data out there where people compare the impacts of serving sizes of different food products. But what's actually important when we're eating food is the nutrition that it gives us rather than the quantity. It isn't the same nutritional value to have a kilogram of beef, milk or spinach. You have to compare what nutritional content there is. And so we're pretty excited to help to inform that sort of global nutritional space. It's something we've already done some work with in New Zealand with Massey University, and this would take some of that work and really amplify it.
That does sound really exciting and kind of hopeful development. My sense is that the European Union globally tends to be quite progressive on these kind of initiatives. So congratulations for getting an opportunity to take part in that discussion, and hopefully that will lead to something really useful. And I often reflect with sustainability more generally that you hear a lot of talk about organisations doing a bit better than they were the previous year, which is great and something to celebrate. But that doesn't tell you in absolute terms anything about really how sustainable that organisation is. Similarly, doing a bit better in relation to some parameter or other than a competitor, great. But again, does that mean you're sustainable or not? And it seems to me that the work you're doing at the Planetary Accounting Network is that crucial thing of actually in absolute terms, what is the impact of this on creating a prosperous future for future generations? So thank you for that. How can people get involved if there are listeners thinking, this sounds awesome, I'd like a bit of this? How can they get involved?
Well, I think if people are working at any organisation, really, from organisations who are working in the food and fibre sector who might be interested in participating in the program, to organisations that are just looking at what to do with their sustainability strategy. We work with organisations who don't even have a sustainability strategy, all the way through to organisations who are ready to do their nature-related financial disclosures, which is, I guess, the front end of that organisational level, that we're really happy to sort of bring you into our network and help support you to apply planetary accounting, to put that scientific context around the work. It's been really interesting. I think we end up working directly with a lot of sustainability managers who are really motivated by the environmental side. But actually, we also work with a lot of the CFOs and chief risk officers, because what this context gives you is a really strong quantification of risk, because it shows you how fast and how far market and regulatory pressures might go. And so there's a lot of organisations who sign up to understand where they need to be to stay in business as we go forward. So there's that opportunity. For those people who are listening who aren't in an organisation that they can link into our framework, then I think one of the most powerful things to do is to reach out to the brands that you want to see Planetary Facts labels and let them know that that's what you want to see. So one of the questions that we often get asked is, how do we know that consumers want this? And we have done quite a lot of testing, so we can show that evidence. But there is nothing quite as compelling as getting an email from your customers to say, we want you to put Planetary Facts on your product and show us the numbers.
Well, that sounds like a great call to action that anybody could take on. So I mentioned earlier that the planetary boundaries are based on decades of internationally recognised and very credible research. So there's a really strong kind of system science foundation to that. And I know from what I've seen of the work that you're doing here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, that is also a very credible build on it. Here in New Zealand, we do have two knowledge systems. And I'm wondering what engagement you are having and how you might be linking in with a kind of Māori perspective in relation to this concept of planetary accounting and the planetary facts.
I think it's a really good question, because there's an incredible wealth of Indigenous knowledge here, and I think that has an opportunity to really advance the work that we're doing with planetary accounting in New Zealand, but also internationally. I think in New Zealand really leads in that space. And so we're pretty stoked. We've recently had a senior Māori advisor join the team, John Reid, who heads up the Ngāi Tahu's Research Centre at Canterbury University, to help us to see those opportunities and to realise them. So we're establishing a senior Māori advisory group as part of this pilot across the food and fibre sector to help us to understand how planetary accounting as a framework sits within Mātauranga Māori principles, but also John's really helped us to understand some of the opportunities we might not have seen otherwise of planetary facts. So the way that you do a planetary facts assessment is that you're getting the data through the whole supply chain of a product. So all of the different places that all the different resources and materials have come together to make this product. And actually in the world we live in, there's a really big disconnect between place and product. If you go to the supermarket and pick a can of tomatoes up, you don't think, oh, well, that was grown on, this farm with these people and where did the can come from? And, you just don't have that insight. And so we're looking at opportunities to bring Māori designers in to help us to create that reconnect. Labels, as people imagine them today, are just a physical thing that sits on a product. But planetary facts will sit on a product, but they'll also sit online where you can interact with them. And so you can, that's where you'd look at the different nutritional elements of different food, for example. But you could also then create that visual connection from the product to place. We also feel that there's a really neat opportunity to labels are always going to be subtly different in one country and another, and so we'd like to have a more New Zealand design of the label and that would work with Māori designers to add to. So perhaps the sort of essence of a koru, or I'm not sure what it will look like. It's not for me to do, but so we're really excited about those opportunities to bring that knowledge into the framework and then to take that knowledge to take it out of New Zealand as well and showcase that.
That sounds really, really interesting and exciting. And you mentioned a little while ago in our conversation about, the possibility that this approach to trying to inform people about the environmental impacts of the food and the products that they buy, the possibility of that being scaled to being almost like a national initiative. As a trading nation, this is a system that we use to tell the world transparently about the footprint of the products that they're buying from us, and linking that with the work you're doing there around a Te Ao Māori perspective on it seems to really, that seems to me could be a really powerful approach. So who else is working in this space? Is there an opportunity for Aotearoa and New Zealand to show some leadership here globally?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because when you show people a planetary facts label or a planetary accounting exercise, people get a real aha moment, like, oh, this is what we need, and who else is doing this? And actually, nobody else is. So I had this amazing experience last year where I got this phone call from a UK number, and it was a really large tech company from the UK, and they were calling to see if we could help them. And, Pan, we've got a relatively small team across New Zealand, and then we've got a few people outside of New Zealand in the UK and Australia. But it's, we're not a giant enterprise, and we've never spent any money on marketing or, SEO presence for our website. And so I was sort of like, how did you find me? And the sustainability lead at this company, he said, oh, well, I've done a global search for organisations that can help me to put planetary boundaries perspective around our sustainability operations. So we had a great chat, and I agreed to send him a proposal. And just before we signed off, I said, so who else have you found in this global search? And he said, nobody. So it's a really surprising niche to be in, because I feel that it's the way forward. But also the response, from the European Commission, it tells me the same thing. We're at that really leading edge, and there's a really exciting opportunity for New Zealand to really step up. And while we're very small, New Zealand's always had a really loud voice, and I think we've also had that clean, green brand that people still think of us like that overseas. And so I think there's a huge opportunity for us to make much bigger change than we could just within our operations here.
And it feels to me a bit like this could be a sort of maturing of that clean green image, putting a bit of 21st century substance behind it, and where it's not so clean and green, kind of owning that and committing to action on it.
Which is really important because the new thing in sustainability is greenwashing. And so people need to be so careful, countries, regions and businesses, about the claims that they make need to be supported by really robust data. And that's what we're hoping to be able to help New Zealand to do, but also globally to help people to make data-driven decisions for the planet.
And of course, the other trend we're seeing is green hushing, where companies decide not to say anything about their sustainability performance for fear of either being accused of greenwashing or, just simpler not to say anything. And this seems to me to be a really useful way of being able to have confidence that the claims you make are defensible.
Yes, that's the goal.
What would it take to really accelerate the work that you're doing at the Planetary Accounting Network?
I think our key challenge is funding at the moment. And so while we're progressing very well to progress faster, we just need better funding. So if anybody out there has some great funding opportunities for us, we would love to hear them.
And what would that funding be for? Is it for people? Is it for stuff, for information?
It is to help us to get the word out, to bring companies on board, to encourage them to get that data out to communities. And so it's all the ancillary work that goes around that, the engagement to help people to understand the importance of it. It's the little things like making sure we have really good quality assurance programs sitting in behind everything that we do. It's the, as a team reaching out to the entire food and fibre sector in New Zealand, that's a lot of people to speak to. And so we need a bigger team and more people, because we don't just want to get this out in New Zealand, we want to get this out internationally. And it's bringing on more and more partners to help us amplify that impact.
And I think from my perspective, I would prefer that you were able to spend more of your energy and focus your expertise and experience on the business of developing the planetary accounting system than searching for funding to help support you doing that.
Absolutely, yes. I think the quicker that we can get the funding secured, the more that we can focus everyone in the team on the goal at hand, which is getting that data out so that people are making the decisions we need for a healthy planet.
So I think it would be lovely now just to transition to a slightly different part of the conversation and talk a bit more about you and some of the advice you might have for listeners. And so I'm interested in what you and your family are doing in your private lives to be more sustainable, because my sense is this is something you're really committed to, certainly as an individual.
Well, I would caveat that by saying we're certainly not perfect, and it's a journey for us as well. There's a lot of things that we do try and do, and there's a lot of things that we could do better. But my main focus is not buying stuff that we don't need. I think that consumerism is the biggest challenge. And so I live in Wānaka. We've got this amazing shop called Wastebusters, which is the tip store, if you like. And, that's our first point of contact for any clothing or other item that we need. That doesn't mean to say we never buy anything new, but that we start there. But that also we think 3 times before we buy something. Can you borrow it? Could you solve the problem with something else? So that's, I think, our primary focus. I have also been trying very hard to grow my own food at home. I have to say that is not my special skill.
Well, good on you for having a go. And I think I should just add for listeners that Kate and I are meeting today at Forest Lodge, a fossil fuel free cherry orchard in central Otago. And apologies if there's a little bit of a background hum on this recording, but that is the inverter for the solar panels that are on the roof of the building that we're in. And Kate said to me when we were planning this trip, we cannot turn up to Mike Case's fossil fuel free cherry orchard in a vehicle with an internal combustion engine, which was quite right. And so I hired an electric vehicle to drive down from Christchurch. Anyway, thank you for your honesty about the efforts you're making as a family to be more sustainable. And I couldn't agree more with that, really thinking 3 times about whether you need to buy a new thing. And just a little personal rant. I really object to being called a consumer. You didn't call me a consumer. Just to make the point that it defines people, husbands, brothers, sisters, daughters, so narrowly in the context of the economic contribution they can make to GDP. I would really love it if we didn't use the term consumer. But it's in our language and it crops up all the time. Anyway, rant over. That's a different conversation for another day, perhaps. So you've kind of hinted at this already, but what would be your top tip to listeners if they were interested in trying to do more themselves to improve the chances of future prosperity?
I think it really is the less is more. So and that isn't to say that we can't have as much fun. You know, I think a sustainable future isn't one where we don't have enough or we have a really miserable life. One of my favourite stats is a study that suggested that it would be better for the environment if we all worked much less, 24-hour work weeks, which is, I'm aspiring to that as well. But, you know, I think it can be a joyful future with less focus on, you know, whether you have the right, you know, the fashionable pants or the new gadget that's come out. It's about finding what the real joy is and not the joy that gets marketed to us.
Yeah, I would agree with that very much. Thinking about books you've read, podcasts you've listened to, or other things of that nature that have been really helpful and influenced you, would you have a recommendation or two for listeners?
I think the best book, if you're only ever going to read one on sustainability, is Hope and Hell by Jonathan Porritt. I've read quite a lot of these books and watched a lot of the documentaries and podcasts, and my concern is that sometimes to make the point, the story gets amplified in the wrong direction, or and sometimes underselling the complexity of the solutions, or sometimes overselling the nature of the crisis. The crisis is immense. We don't need to oversell it. Hope and Hell is the most accurate depiction of the situation I've ever read. And it's in the title. It does have a hopeful finish, which you need as well, because I think while it's a pretty dicey situation that we're in, we have to have hope and we have to keep pushing forward. And so that's my recommendation.
Thank you very much. That's not one I've read, so I'll be taking up that recommendation as well. And finally, if you had a superpower that you could wield to ensure that there was the possibility of future generations prospering, aka a more sustainable world, what would that superpower be?
You gave me a heads up on this question, and so you'd think I'd have a good answer for it, and I have thought about it a lot, and I really struggle to find a good one. The thing that I keep coming back to is time travel. I would like to be able to take data from where we are now and take it back in time, or go into the future and bring that data back to here. I think we are running out of time at a pace that's quite alarming, and I feel that we're just getting to a point that we're starting to make that change. I hope we have enough time to do it.
Thank you for that. That's, again, yet another different sort of superpower to the superpowers that other guests have suggested. So thank you for sharing that with us. And I'm sorry it caused you some difficulty to come up with it. Look, it's been a fascinating discussion. I was really looking forward to it and I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it as well.
So have you given me a cause for hope? Absolutely. As soon as I came across you and the work you're doing at Pan, I kind of thought this looks something really useful and a cause for me to be optimistic. Have you given me and listeners a kind of call to action? And yes, really thinking about the stuff that we consume, and thank you for the work that you're doing that will hopefully in future help us to have a clearer sense of the impacts of that consumption. So thank you for that. And for listeners out there, thank you so much for listening to this episode of my podcast series. If you're interested in more conversations about people, planet and food, please subscribe to Sigest and rate and review the show. And please do share this with other people you think might be interested. And if you've got any questions or comments, it would be great to hear from you. And you could get in touch with me on sigest@plantandfood.co.nz. And I'd be especially interested to hear if you think there are people working at this interface between people and planet and food that I should interview. That would be awesome. So thank you very much for listening. See you next time. Mā te wā.